Justice has a pulse in small towns. You can feel it in the soil, hear it in the water that runs beneath streets named after founding fathers and company men. In Silver Creek, that pulse has been fading for decades, growing weaker with each funeral, each diagnosis, each child born with something not quite right. They buried their dead and their questions in equal measure, whispered their suspicions behind closed doors while cashing paychecks with the same name that adorned the chemical plant visible from every corner of town. Some truths don't dissolve. They settle into riverbeds. They collect in tissue samples. They wait in sealed drums beneath unmarked earth. They haunt the memories of men who chose silence over speaking, profit over protection. Now the current shifts. A woman stands at the edge of contaminated waters, case files in hand, the weight of 30 years legal battle in her eyes. Behind her, the company's silver towers rise against the dying light. Before her, graves too numerous to ignore. Some reckonings come late, but they come all the same. The fluorescent lights of the Jefferson County Medical Examiner's office cast a harsh glow over the body on the steel table. Margaret Reynolds stood beside the county coroner, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of William Marshall's ravaged form. At 74, his body should have shown the normal wear of age instead. It was a roadmap of chemical devastation. Liver cancer that metastasized to his lungs and brain, Dr. Patel explained, her voice clinical but not unkind. But look at these lesions on the skin. The unusual pigmentation. I've seen this pattern before in chemical exposure cases. Maggie nodded, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, crow's feet deepening around her eyes as she frowned. At 58, she had spent 3 decades building a reputation as one of the Midwest's most formidable environmental attorneys. This wasn't her first autopsy, nor would it be her last. His wife Erin said he worked at Blackwood for 37 years. Maintenance department, had access to every area of the plant, Maggie said, making notes in her leather-bound portfolio. That tracks with what I'm seeing. Multiple chemical exposures over decades. Dr. Patel hesitated. And he's the 3rd former employee this year with this specific pattern of disease progression? Maggie looked up sharply. The 3rd who authorized those autopsies. County did. Nothing came of it officially. Dr. Patel's eyes met Maggie's. But off the record, something's very wrong in Silver Creek. Miss Reynolds. Very wrong indeed. 3 hours later, Maggie sat across from Erin Marshall in the modest living room of the home the Marshalls had purchased in 1968. Faded photographs lined the walls. William in his Vietnam uniform. Their wedding day. 2 children growing through the years into adults who now rested beside their father in Silver Creek Cemetery. They all worked at Blackwood, Erin said, her voice steady despite the grief etched into the lines of her 72-year-old face. Bill in maintenance. Tommy followed his daddy's footsteps, and Sarah, she was in the lab, so proud of her chemistry degree. She placed 3 death certificates on the coffee table between them. All gone within 5 years of each other. All cancer. Maggie studied the documents, her mind already building connections, pathways of causation and liability. Mrs. Marshall, I need to ask, did any doctors ever suggest a link between their illnesses and Blackwood Chemical? Erin's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. Suggest our family doctor, Dr. Hannigan, practically shouted it from the rooftops until... She stopped abruptly. Until what? Mrs. Marshall, until he was offered a position as head of medicine at Silver Creek Memorial Hospital. The hospital Blackwood built, the cancer wing Blackwood funded. She met Maggie's eyes. He stopped talking after that. Retired early to Florida 3 years ago. Maggie made another note, and no one else spoke up. In a company town like Silver Creek, when Blackwood employs half the county, Erin shook her head. People have mortgages, Ms. Reynolds, college tuitions, medical bills. The unspoken reality hung between them in places like Silver Creek. Economic survival often trumped truth, health, even justice. I understand, But you're willing to speak up now, Maggie observed. Aaron's gnarled hands tightened around a worn handkerchief. I've buried my husband and both my children. I'm 72 years old with stage 2 breast cancer myself. Her eyes hardened. What exactly do I have left to lose? Richard Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching darkness settle over Silver Creek. From this height, the town looked peaceful, the winding river that gave it its name, the neat grid of residential streets, and at the northern edge, the sprawling complex of Blackwood Chemical, its lights blazing against the gathering night. His father had built the first processing plant in 1947, returning from World War II with chemical engineering knowledge and a determination to turn it into an American success story. Now, Blackwood Chemical employed over 3,000 people across 3 states, with this headquarters facility still the beating heart of the operation. At 62, Richard resembled his late father, the same imposing height, the same silver-gray eyes that could assess a situation in seconds. But where his father had built an empire through sheer force of will, Richard had maintained it through strategic adaptation. Blackwood Chemical had survived the recession of the 80s, the environmental regulations of the 90s, and the economic turbulence after 9/11. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Blackwood, the executive committee is assembled. His assistant, Patricia, had been with him for 18 years, long enough to remember when his hair had been brown instead of silver, when his face hadn't carried the deep lines of responsibility. Thank you, Patricia. I'll be right there. The boardroom fell silent as Richard entered. 8 men and 2 women, the leadership team of Blackwood Chemical, watched him with expressions ranging from respect to wariness. Thank you all for staying late, Richard began, taking his seat at the head of the table. I've just received word that Hayes and Associates has called an emergency strategy meeting. It seems Margaret Reynolds has taken on Aaron Marshall as a client. Franklin Pierce, the company's 70-year-old COO and Richard's father's oldest friend, removed his glasses with deliberate slowness. The environmental crusader, the one who took down Midwest Petroleum. The same, Richard confirmed. She's requesting all documentation related to chemical disposal at this facility from 1960 to present day. A murmur rippled through the room. That's over 40 years of records. Diane Lowell, the head of HR, noted. What exactly is she looking for? Cancer clusters, Richard replied bluntly. Specifically, 3 deaths in the Marshall family, all former employees, all cancer-related. Franklin leaned forward. Richard, we've been through this before. The EPA investigations in 92 and 03 both cleared us. The groundwater testing showed acceptable levels of the chemicals we were testing for at that time. Richard finished. But Reynolds won't be looking just at compliance with regulations. She'll be looking at what we knew, when we knew it, and what we did with that knowledge. The implication hung in the air. Regulations evolved as science advanced, but corporate knowledge might have outpaced regulatory requirements. The silent question, had Blackwood Chemical known more than it disclosed? We should simply deny the records request, suggested Marcus Webb, the younger, ambitious VP of operations. Make her file a formal discovery motion. Drag it out. Richard studied the man who represented the new generation of Blackwood leadership MBA from Wharton. Strategic mind, minimal connection to the community beyond his executive role, and feed right into her narrative that we're hiding something. Richard shook his head. No, we comply with the request, but we review everything first. I want to know exactly what she'll find before she finds it. The meeting continued with assignments of review teams, legal preparations, and media strategies. Throughout, Richard maintained his composed exterior, while a persistent unease grew within him. He had joined the company in 1985 after his military service. What had happened in those earlier decades, during his father's leadership later that night, as Richard drove through the quiet streets of Silver Creek toward his home in the hills overlooking the town, his phone rang. The name on the screen, Jefferson Hayes, sent a jolt of recognition through him. Jeff, he answered, putting the call on speaker. Midnight calls from our legal counsel rarely bring good news. I'd have waited until morning if I could. Jefferson's deep voice filled the car. But Reynolds has expanded her investigation. She's not just looking at the Marshall family now. She's gathering information on every cancer case in a 20-mile radius going back to 1970. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's extensive. It's more than extensive. Richard, it's a pattern-seeking expedition. And here's the thing, she's good. Damn good. If there's a pattern to find, she'll find it. Jefferson Hayes had been Blackwood Chemical's outside counsel for 20 years. At 65, he was not only a brilliant attorney, but also a man who understood the complex relationship between the company and Silver Creek. What's your recommendation? Richard asked, turning onto the private road that led to his house. Full cooperation on the surface. Behind the scenes, we need to identify vulnerabilities, prepare responses, consider settlement parameters if it comes to that. Settlement implies guilt, Jeff. Settlement implies business sense. Richard, you and I both remember the aftermath of the Sanderson chemical case in Ohio. $200 million in damages. The plant closed. 1,000 jobs lost. Richard pulled into his garage, but didn't immediately exit the car. My father built this company to last, Jeff, to support this community. I won't be the Blackwood who abandoned Silver Creek. A heavy sigh came through the speaker. Then we need to be smart about this. I've known Maggie Reynolds since law school. She's not in this for a quick settlement. She believes in causes, and right now, her cause is Silver Creek. After ending the call, Richard sat in the darkened garage, his mind circling back to a locked file cabinet in his home office, his father's personal papers, which he had never fully examined after inheriting them 15 years ago. Something about this situation, about Reynolds' investigation, pulled at threads of memory conversations overheard, tensions observed during his youth, his father's occasional dark moods and cryptic statements about necessary compromises. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he would begin his own investigation, starting with his father's records. The Westbridge Hotel in Cincinnati was a convenient neutral territory close enough to Silver Creek for a day trip, far enough to avoid local attention. Maggie had booked a suite on the 12th floor, transforming the living room area into a temporary war room. Documents covered every surface. Laptop screens displayed data sets, and a large whiteboard was filled with names, dates, and connecting lines. Carol Weber, Maggie's former assistant and closest friend since their days working environmental cases in the 80s, studied the board with a critical eye. At 64, Carol had officially retired from legal work, but still consulted on cases that mattered to her. This one definitely qualified. 37 cancer diagnoses in a town of 12,000, Carol noted. That's significantly above national averages, especially for the rare liver and kidney variants. And look at the geographic distribution. Maggie pointed to a map pinned to one wall. Higher concentrations downstream from the plant, and in neighborhoods where plant workers historically lived. Correlation isn't causation. Mags, you know that better than anyone. No, but it's a start. Maggie pulled out another document. This is a 1983 EPA site visit report. Look at the section about waste disposal practices. Carol adjusted her reading glasses. Company representatives indicated that all chemical waste was transported to approved disposal facilities. But there's no verification, no transportation records cited. Exactly. It was the Reagan era the EPA was gutted, operating on minimal staffing. They took Blackwood's word without verification. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maggie's new assistant, Zoe Harris, 30 years younger, whip-smart but inexperienced, entered with a fresh stack of documents. The Silver Creek Hospital records you requested, Ms. Reynolds. And Mr. Dalton called again. He's anxious about the deposition tomorrow. Don't in him. Tell him I'll call back within the hour. And Zoe, have you finished digitizing the employee records? Almost. I should have them compiled by morning. After Zoe left, Carol gave Maggie a questioning look. You trust her with all this? I have to. This case is too big for just us, and the firm can't spare more senior staff yet. Maggie sighed, rubbing her temples. Not until we have something concrete. Speaking of concrete, Carol held up a hospital record. Look at this. William Marshall was treated for chemical burns in 1978. The attending physician noted, and I quote, patient reports exposure to effluent from the North Drainage System at Blackwood facility. North Drainage? That's not on any of the official site maps. Exactly. A surge of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of discovering a key piece of evidence, coursed through Maggie. This could be the thread that unraveled the whole tapestry of deception. We need to find someone who worked there in the 70s. Someone in maintenance who would know about unofficial drainage systems. Aaron Marshall might know. The hotel phone rang, cutting off Carol's suggestion. Maggie answered, expecting the front desk. Ms. Reynolds. The voice was male, deliberately disguised. Check under your door. The line went dead. Maggie rushed to the door, finding a manila envelope that had been slipped beneath it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a hand-drawn map of the Blackwood facility with the North Drainage System clearly marked, leading directly to Silver Creek. A note in the margin read, Midnight Chemical Disposals, 1976 to 1984. Security logs destroyed. I was there. No signature. No way to verify the source. This could be legitimate evidence, Carol said, examining the map. Or it could be someone setting you up. Remember what happened in the Westlake case? Maggie remembered all too well falsified evidence planted by corporate interests to discredit her entire case. It had nearly ended her career. We proceed carefully, verify everything independently, and we keep this between us for now. She folded the map, tucking it into her portfolio. I need to get some rest before tomorrow's depositions. After Carol left, Maggie began her nightly ritual, reviewing notes, planning tomorrow's strategy, setting her alarm. The routine calmed her mind, preparing it for sleep despite the high stakes of the case. As she finally settled into bed, she allowed herself a rare moment of personal reflection. It had been 8 years since Robert's death, her husband of 22 years, taken by the same type of rare liver cancer now appearing in Silver Creek. His case had never been linked to environmental causes, classified instead as one of those medical mysteries. But the similarities nagged at her, fueling her dedication to cases like this one. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless, filled with dreams of flowing water turned toxic and faceless corporations protected by walls of paper and procedure. Maggie awoke disoriented, her head pounding with a dull, persistent ache. This wasn't her hotel room. The furnishings were different, more luxurious, unfamiliar. Sunlight streamed through half-open curtains, illuminating an elegantly appointed suite that she had no memory of entering. Instinct kicked in before panic could take hold. She assessed her situation, clinically fully clothed in yesterday's outfit. No physical injuries apparent. Her watch showing 7:23 a.m. The last thing she remembered was falling asleep in her own hotel room around 11 p.m. Moving carefully, Maggie swung her legs over the edge of the bed, fighting a wave of dizziness that suggested some kind of sedation. Her purse sat on a nearby chair inside. Her wallet appeared untouched, cash and cards still present. But her phone was missing, as was her portfolio containing case notes. A small USB drive lay on the nightstand beside a folded note. With cautious fingers, she opened the paper. They know you're investigating. Be careful. Lobby security cameras disabled between 2 to 3 a.m. A friend. The cryptic warning sent a chill through her. Someone had drugged her, moved her to a different room, taken her phone and notes, but left her this USB drive. Why and who was behind it? Someone trying to help her investigation? Or someone setting her up? A soft electronic beep from the door made her freeze. Someone was using a key card. Maggie quickly slipped the USB drive into her jacket pocket and moved toward the bathroom, the only potential escape route. Before she could reach it, The main door opened. A hotel maid entered, then startled visibly at seeing Maggie. "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. The system showed this room as vacant." Maggie made an instant decision to play along. "There must be some mix-up at the front desk. I checked in late last night. I'll update the system right away. My apologies for the disturbance." After the maid left, Maggie moved to the window, assessing her location within the hotel. She was now on the 18th floor, 6 floors higher than her original room. The view revealed a service entrance below, where staff moved between the building and a loading dock. The room phone rang, startling her. After a moment's hesitation, she answered. "Ms. Reynolds," the same disguised voice from last night. "You have 15 minutes before they realize where you are. The USB contains what you need. Exit through the service elevators. Don't trust your assistant." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Maggie's mind raced. Who was they, and why shouldn't she trust Zoe? No time to puzzle it through now. If someone had gone to these lengths drugging her, moving her, warning her the threat was real, whether from Blackwood Chemical or some other interest in the case, Maggie checked the hallway, then made her way toward the service area. Avoiding the main elevators where cameras would certainly be operating, the service elevator required a key card, but a young maintenance worker approaching provided the opportunity she needed. "Excuse me," she said, summoning her most authoritative tone. "I'm having trouble with the lock on 1812. The manager asked me to check with maintenance while they prepare a new room for me." The young man hesitated only briefly before swiping his card. "These locks have been acting up all month. I can escort you." "That won't be necessary. I need to grab breakfast before my meeting." "Which floor is the kitchen on?" "Basement level B. But guests aren't supposed to." "Thank you. I'll be sure to mention your helpfulness to management." She stepped into the elevator before he could object further. The basement kitchen was a hive of activity staff preparing breakfast service, deliveries arriving, the chaos providing perfect cover. Maggie navigated through the space confidently, as if she belonged, making her way toward what appeared to be a service exit. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." A security guard spotted her, moving to intercept. Maggie increased her pace, pushing through double doors into a loading area. The guard followed, his radio crackling with what sounded like instructions. She spotted a delivery truck preparing to leave, its driver checking paperwork. "They're behind schedule again," she said breathlessly to the driver, gesturing back toward the kitchen. "Ask me to tell you to go ahead to the next stop. They'll call in their adjustments." The confused driver hesitated, but years of dealing with hotel bureaucracy made the request seem plausible enough. He shrugged, gesturing to the passenger door. "Heading to Riverside Supplies if that helps you." Maggie climbed in just as the security guard emerged into the loading area. Scanning for her, the truck pulled away, and only then did she allow herself a moment to process what had just happened. Someone had deliberately targeted her, yet someone else, perhaps the same friend who had slipped her the map, had intervened. The USB drive in her pocket felt heavy with implications. Whatever it contained had been worth significant risk to deliver to her. "You with the health department?" the driver asked conversationally. "Legal consultant," Maggie replied, offering no further details. Had a feeling. They've been having all sorts of troubles since that convention last month. Food poisoning lawsuit waiting to happen. If you ask me." Maggie seized the offered explanation. "Yes, well, these matters require discretion." 20 minutes later, she thanked the driver and exited at Riverside Supplies, immediately hailing a taxi to take her to Carol's home in the suburbs. She needed a secure location to view the USB contents, and her hotel room was clearly compromised. Carol's surprise at seeing her on the doorstep quickly turned to concern as Maggie recounted the morning's events. "Jesus, Mags, this isn't just hardball legal tactics anymore. This is criminal intimidation." "Which means we're onto something significant." Maggie removed the USB drive from her pocket. "Let's see what was worth drugging me for." Carol's home office computer was deliberately kept disconnected from the internet, a precaution from her years working sensitive cases. They inserted the drive, scanning for viruses before opening its contents. My God, Carol whispered as the files appeared. The drive contained internal Blackwood chemical memos dating from 1968 to 1982, detailing a specific chemical compound, BW17, developed by the company for industrial degreasing. The documents revealed early toxicity studies showing liver and kidney damage in laboratory animals, followed by executive decisions to continue production without expanded testing or disclosure to regulatory agencies. Most damning was a series of internal health reports tracking unusual illness patterns among workers in the BW17 production facility reports that were marked chairman's eyes only and never shared with regulators or workers. This is exactly what we need, Maggie said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Direct evidence of knowledge and concealment. But we can't use it, Carol replied. Not as is. It was obtained illegally, planted on you by an anonymous source. No judge would admit it. No, but now we know exactly what to look for through legitimate channels. Maggie was already making notes. We request these specific documents through formal discovery. If Blackwood claims they don't exist, we'll know they're lying and can pursue spoliation charges. And if someone was willing to drug you to provide this information, what else might they do to stop you from using it? Maggie paused, the full implications of the morning's events sinking in. I need to be careful, change hotels, vary my routine, and I need to figure out who I can trust. She thought of the warning about her assistant. Can I use your phone? I need to make some calls that can't be traced back to me. First, she called her law firm, speaking directly to the managing partner, Alexander Bennett. Alex, I need immediate digital security support on the Silver Creek case, full sweep of my office, new secure devices, and background verification on Zoe Harris. That's serious, Alexander's voice was concerned. We can have the security team there by afternoon. Should we alert authorities? Not yet. I have suspicions, but no proof of who's behind this. And until I know who to trust. Understood. Check in every 6 hours. Maggie. If we don't hear from you, we'll take action. Her next call was to Jefferson Hayes, not as Blackwood's counsel, but as her former law school classmate and someone who might have insights into the current corporate culture. Maggie Reynolds, he answered, surprise evident in his voice. Calling from an unknown number. Should I be concerned? Let's just say I'm being cautious. Jeff, someone's playing rough in the Silver Creek investigation. A pause. Blackwood hasn't authorized any extra-legal approaches. Richard Blackwood runs a cleaner operation than that. Maybe he does, but someone with access to resources is taking an unhealthy interest in my whereabouts and my evidence. Another pause, longer this time. I'll ask some questions, discreetly. In the meantime, watch yourself. Maggie, these old company towns have deep loyalties and long memories. One more thing. Jeff, does the designation chairman's eyes only mean anything in Blackwood's document classification system? The sharp intake of breath told her everything before he even spoke. Where did you hear that phrase, so it does exist? It was Edward Blackwood's personal classification, Richard's father, used for matters he handled personally, outside normal corporate channels, discontinued after his death in 1990. And who would have access to those documents now? Officially, they should have been integrated into corporate records. Unofficially, I couldn't say. After ending the call, Maggie sat back, processing this new information. The documents on the USB drive had been Edward Blackwood's personal files, which meant someone with access to the most restricted Blackwood archives was feeding her information. I need to get to my deposition, she finally said, checking her watch. But I can't go in blind without my notes. Use mine, Carol offered, pulling out a leather portfolio. I made copies of everything during our session yesterday. Old habits. Maggie felt a rush of gratitude for her friend's foresight. I need one more favor. Can you discreetly reach out to some of our old EPA contacts? See if anyone remembers inspections at Blackwood during the 70s and early 80s, particularly regarding a compound called BW17. Consider it done. And Maggie, Carol's expression was grave. When you leave here, assume you're being watched. The conference room at Hayes & Associates projected understated power mahogany furnishings, subtle lighting, and views of downtown Cincinnati that reminded everyone of the firm's prominence. Jefferson Hayes sat at one end of the table, flanked by two younger attorneys. Across from them, Maggie and Aaron Marshall faced Blackwood Chemical's representatives. Richard Blackwood had chosen to attend, personally unusual for a CEO in preliminary proceedings. Beside him sat Franklin Pierce, the company's long-serving COO, and Marcus Webb, the younger VP of Operations. Thank you all for accommodating today's deposition on short notice, Jefferson began, his deep voice carrying the gravitas of his 65 years and distinguished legal career. Before we begin, I want to clarify that while this is a formal deposition, we are still in the fact-finding stage. No lawsuit has been filed, and Blackwood Chemical is cooperating fully to understand the concerns raised by Mrs. Marshall. Maggie noted the careful framing positioning Blackwood as cooperative while establishing that no legal action was yet in progress. Jefferson had always been skilled at setting advantageous tones. For the record, Maggie responded, my client has authorized me to state that while we appreciate Blackwood Chemical's willingness to participate in this deposition, we are actively investigating a potential pattern of environmental contamination affecting multiple Silver Creek residents. Mrs. Marshall's testimony today represents just one aspect of that broader investigation. A subtle shift in Richard Blackwood's posture caught Maggie's attention. Unlike the other Blackwood representatives, whose expressions hardened at her statement, Richard seemed interested, almost as if he were as curious about what might be uncovered as she was. The deposition proceeded with Aaron Marshall describing her family's employment history with Blackwood, the timeline of their illnesses, and her observations about similar health issues among neighbors and fellow church members. Mrs. Marshall, Jefferson asked during his cross-examination, did any physician ever specifically state that your husband's or children's illnesses were caused by chemical exposure at Blackwood facilities? Dr. Hannigan said. Aaron began. In writing, Jefferson clarified. In any medical report or official diagnosis? No, Aaron admitted. But he told us. Before the hospital position. Jefferson nodded sympathetically. I understand this has been an incredibly difficult time for you. Mrs. Marshall, losing family members to cancer is devastating, but without medical documentation establishing causation, if I may, Maggie interrupted, Mrs. Marshall, did your husband ever mention specific chemicals he worked with during his employment at Blackwood? Objection, Jefferson said smoothly. Calls for speculation and hearsay. This is a deposition, not a trial, Maggie countered. And Mrs. Marshall's recollection of conversations with her late husband is directly relevant to establishing the timeline of potential exposures. Jefferson inclined his head, conceding the point. The witness may answer, but I note our objection for the record. Aaron straightened in her chair. Bill mentioned many chemicals over the years, but there was one he talked about more after he transferred to Building 7 in 1976. Something they called the new solution. He said it worked better than anything they'd used before, but it made his eyes burn even through his safety glasses, made his skin itch for days after handling it. Maggie kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. Building 7, 1976. The timeline matched the USB documents exactly. Did he ever mention a designation, a number, or code for this chemical? Franklin Pierce shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with Richard Blackwood. He called it B-dub sometimes, Aaron replied. I remember because he'd come home and say, had another run-in with B-dub today. Like it was a person he didn't get along with. BW, almost certainly BW-17. And was there a specific incident involving this chemical that stands out in your memory? Aaron's eyes drifted, recalling. March of '78, Bill came home with bandages on his arms, said there'd been a spill in Building 7. The chemical had eaten right through his work clothes. He was in the hospital for 3 days. Maggie slid a document across the table. I'd like to enter into evidence this hospital record from March 17th in 1978 describing chemical burns to William Marshall's arms and torso. The attending physician's notes specifically reference effluent from the north drainage system at Blackwood facility. Richard Blackwood accepted the document, studying it intently while Franklin Pierce leaned in to view it as well. The older man's face paled visibly. I'd also like to inquire, Maggie continued, about Blackwood Chemical's waste disposal practices for Building 7 during the 1970s and early 1980s, particularly regarding a compound designated BW17. A tense silence fell over the room. Jefferson Hayes recovered first. Ms. Reynolds, this deposition was scheduled to document Mrs. Marshall's claims regarding her family members' illnesses. If you wish to expand the scope to include specific operational details of Blackwood facilities from 40 years ago, we'll need to reschedule with appropriate company representatives and historical documentation. I understand, Maggie replied evenly. In that case, I'll be submitting a formal document request regarding BW17, all internal studies conducted on its toxicity, disposal procedures for Building 7, and any health monitoring of employees who worked with the compound. Franklin Pierce cleared his throat. I believe those records may be challenging to locate. During our digitization process in the late 90s, many older paper records were condensed. Condensed, Maggie repeated. You mean destroyed, archived, Franklin corrected. According to retention policies appropriate for that time period, Richard Blackwood, who had remained largely silent throughout the deposition, finally spoke. We will, of course, conduct a thorough search for any relevant documents. Miss Reynolds, Blackwood Chemical has nothing to hide regarding our historical operations. Something in his tone, a subtle emphasis, caught Maggie's attention. Was he sending a message or simply performing the expected role of a confident CEO? The deposition concluded shortly thereafter, with arrangements made for additional document requests and potential follow-up testimony. As the participants gathered their materials, Richard approached Maggie directly. Ms. Reynolds, he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. My father built Blackwood Chemical with a commitment to this community. If there are historical issues that need to be addressed, I want to know about them as much as you do. Maggie studied him carefully, the lines of his face, the steady gaze, the posture of a man accustomed to command but perhaps carrying an unseen burden. Is that so, Mr. Blackwood? Even if what I discover threatens the company your father built, especially then, his response was immediate, surprising her with its apparent sincerity. Silver Creek and Blackwood Chemical have been intertwined for generations. One cannot thrive while the other suffers. Before she could respond, Jefferson approached, ending their private exchange with practiced diplomatic timing. Maggie, always formidable, Jefferson said with professional courtesy. I've arranged for copies of today's transcript to be delivered to your office by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Jeff, she replied, gathering her materials. I'll be in touch regarding those document requests. As Maggie and Aaron left the conference room, Maggie felt Richard Blackwood's gaze following her, thoughtful, assessing, and carrying what seemed like genuine concern. An unusual reaction from the CEO of a company she was investigating. Most executives in his position projected only confidence and dismissal. Richard Blackwood, it seemed, was either an exceptionally skilled actor or a man genuinely troubled by what might lie buried in his company's past. Either way, he had just become considerably more interesting to her investigation. Essedothurn. 2 days later, Maggie sat in her temporary office at her firm's Cincinnati branch, reviewing the formal response to her document requests. As expected, Blackwood Chemical claimed that most records relating to BW17 had been archived during the company's digital transition and would require extensive searching to locate. Convenient, she muttered, making notes on potential motions to compel more immediate production. Her office phone rang, the secure line installed after the hotel incident. Reynolds, she answered. Ms. Reynolds, this is Patricia Whitmore, Mr. Blackwood's executive assistant, Mr. Blackwood would like to meet with you privately regarding your investigation. Tonight at 8 p.m., if you're available. Maggie's suspicions immediately flared. Any particular reason Mr. Blackwood doesn't want to arrange this meeting through our respective legal teams? He believes the matter is both urgent and sensitive, requiring direct communication. He's suggested the Veterans Memorial Plaza downtown, a public location where you can feel secure. A public meeting rather than a private office. Interesting. Either Blackwood was being thoughtful about her security concerns, or he had his own reasons for avoiding official channels. Tell Mr. Blackwood I'll be there, but I'll be bringing an associate for my own protection. He'll be alone as well. Ms. Reynolds, he simply asks that whatever is discussed remains between the parties present until you both agree otherwise. After ending the call, Maggie immediately contacted Carol, filling her in on the unexpected invitation. It's obviously a trap, Carol declared. The CEO wants a private meeting outside normal channels. Classic intimidation setup. Maybe, Maggie conceded, but it's also potentially valuable. If Blackwood is willing to talk without his legal team present, he might reveal something useful. Or he might be trying to compromise you, make it look like you're negotiating improperly. You need a witness. That's why you'll be there, at a distance. Document everything, but stay out of sight unless there's trouble. The Veterans Memorial Plaza was strategically clever, a public space with multiple approaches and exits. Well lit, but with enough ambient noise from nearby traffic to ensure private conversation. Maggie arrived 15 minutes early, surveying the area from a bench near the central monument. Carol positioned herself at a cafe across the street, maintaining line of sight while appearing to be just another patron enjoying an evening coffee. At precisely 8 p.m., Richard Blackwood approached, alone as promised. He wore casual clothes, khakis, and a navy blazer, rather than his business suit, making him less immediately recognizable to passers-by. Ms. Reynolds, he greeted her, taking a seat on the bench with enough distance to respect personal boundaries. Thank you for agreeing to meet like this. Curiosity got the better of me, she replied honestly. It's not every day a CEO requests a clandestine meeting with the attorney investigating his company. A small smile touched his lips. Clandestine suggests something illicit. I prefer to think of this as unfiltered. No lawyers, no corporate protocols, no press releases. Just two people discussing the potential poisoning of an entire community. Her tone was pointed, challenging. Richard didn't flinch from the accusation. That's exactly why I wanted to meet. Because if what you're suggesting is true, if Blackwood Chemical operations have harmed Silver Creek residents, I need to know. Not through legal filters, not through corporate risk management assessments, directly. Maggie studied him carefully. 28 years of legal practice had honed her ability to read people, to distinguish genuine concern from performance. Richard Blackwood projected sincerity, but CEOs of his caliber were often skilled at precisely such projection. Why now, she asked. Blackwood Chemical has faced environmental questions before. What makes this investigation different? Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the memorial granite slabs engraved with the names of local veterans from conflicts spanning World War I through Afghanistan. My name is on that memorial, he said finally. Not as a casualty, obviously, but as a veteran. Gulf War, Army Corps of Engineers. We handled chemical weapons mitigation, among other things. The connection wasn't immediately obvious. Maggie waited for him to continue. I saw firsthand what chemical exposure does to human beings, watched men suffer effects that would follow them for life. His eyes returned to hers, intense with something that looked remarkably like moral conviction. When I came back and joined the company in '85, I implemented new safety protocols, upgraded containment systems, established more rigorous testing. But you never looked backward, Maggie observed. Never investigated what happened before your time. No, he admitted. I told myself the past was past, that my responsibility was to ensure current and future operations met the highest standards. And now I'm not so certain that was enough. He reached into his jacket, withdrawing a folded paper. This is a copy of a letter my father wrote in 1979. I found it 2 days ago while searching through his personal papers. Maggie accepted the document cautiously. The letterhead showed Edward Blackwood's personal stationery, not company letterhead. It was addressed to Dr. Harrison Mills, then Director of Research and Development. Harrison. The preliminary findings on BW17 liver function tests are concerning. Suspend expanded production until we have more conclusive results. If these effects are replicable, we'll need to reformulate completely before market expansion. Keep this between us, no written reports through official channels yet. Too much regulatory attention would be premature and potentially damaging. The workers in Building 7 should be rotated to other assignments for the next quarter, while we evaluate. Attribute it to production scheduling, not health concerns. No need to create panic over inconclusive data. I'll take personal responsibility for this decision and its consequences. Maggie read it twice, her mind immediately cataloging the legal implications. This was evidence of knowledge of potential harm, deliberate avoidance of regulatory oversight, and a decision to conceal health concerns from workers. This letter alone establishes a basis for significant liability, she said, professional instincts overtaking her surprise at being handed such evidence. Why would you share this with me? Because I need to know the truth, Richard replied, his expression troubled. Not just what can be proven in court, but what actually happened. My father wrote that letter the year before I left for West Point. By the time I joined the company, BW17 was no longer in production. All records indicated it had been discontinued due to market factors. You never knew about the health concerns, never, until your questions about Building 7 and BW17 during the deposition. I saw Franklin's reaction. He knew something I didn't. He was my father's right-hand man for decades. Maggie carefully refolded the letter. Mr. Blackwood, while I appreciate this information, I have to ask, what do you expect in return for sharing it? His response surprised her. Nothing that compromises your investigation or your client's interests. But if Blackwood Chemical caused harm under my father's leadership, I want to be part of making it right, not just through court-mandated settlements, but through real remediation and health support for affected families. That's unusually forthcoming for a CEO facing potential litigation. I'm not just a CEO, Ms. Reynolds. I'm a second-generation Silver Creek native whose name is on every building, every paycheck, every product that comes out of that town. If my father made decisions that harm the community, that legacy falls to me as well. The sincerity in his voice was compelling, but Maggie had encountered convincing corporate performances before. This could easily be an elaborate strategy to gain her trust, influence her approach to the case, perhaps even entrap her in some ethical breach. I'll need to verify this letter's authenticity, she said finally. And while I appreciate the gesture, it doesn't change the fundamentals of my investigation. I wouldn't expect it to. In fact, I'd be disappointed if it did. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. I'm continuing my own internal investigation into historical BW17 production and disposal. If I find more relevant information, would you be open to another meeting like this? Maggie considered the risks and potential benefits. Yes, but next time, let's both bring one trusted colleague for transparency and protection. Agreed, he extended his hand. Despite the circumstances, it's been illuminating to meet you properly. Ms. Reynolds. She accepted the handshake, noting his firm grip and direct gaze. Likewise, Mr. Blackwood. As he walked away, Maggie remained on the bench, examining her conflicting impressions. Richard Blackwood had just voluntarily provided damaging evidence against his own company, an almost unheard of action for a CEO. Either he was executing an extremely sophisticated legal strategy, or he was genuinely troubled by the possibility that his family's company had caused harm under his father's leadership. Both possibilities required careful consideration, and both made the Silver Creek case considerably more complex than she had initially anticipated. 3 days later, Maggie stood in the Silver Creek Public Library's local history room, examining town maps from the 1970s. The municipal archives had proven unexpectedly helpful. Small towns often maintained better historical records than cities, where turnover and budget cuts frequently led to gaps in documentation. Here it is, she murmured, finding what she'd been searching for on a 1977 utility map. The north drainage system, mentioned in William Marshall's hospital record, was clearly marked a secondary outflow pipe leading from the Blackwood facility directly to Silver Creek, bypassing the main waste treatment infrastructure. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Fenton, peered over her shoulder. Finding everything you need, dear. Yes, thank you. These maps are incredibly well preserved. Mrs. Fenton beamed with pride. My husband was the town engineer for 32 years. He believed in keeping proper records. She lowered her voice. He also believed in keeping copies at home, especially after certain disagreements with Blackwood management in the late 70s. Maggie's attention sharpened. What kind of disagreements? The older woman glanced around the empty room before continuing. Arthur, my husband, raised concerns about that northern drainage pipe, said it wasn't up to code, bypassed too many safety systems. Next thing we knew, the town council voted to streamline the approval process for Blackwood's infrastructure projects. Arthur's department lost oversight authority. That must have been frustrating for him. Infuriating, but not surprising. Back then, Edward Blackwood's word was practically law in Silver Creek. She straightened a nearby stack of documents. Arthur kept personal copies of everything after that, called it his insurance policy. Maggie considered this new information carefully. Mrs. Fenton, would your husband's personal records still exist? Oh, yes. Our son has them all boxed up in our attic. Arthur passed last year pancreatic cancer. A shadow crossed her face. Like so many others around here. I'm very sorry for your loss. Maggie paused, then made a decision. Mrs. Fenton, I'm an environmental attorney investigating potential connections between Blackwood chemical operations and health issues in Silver Creek. Your husband's records could be invaluable to understanding what happened here. The librarian's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with determination. It's about time someone looked into this. Too many funerals in this town, too many children sick. She took a small notepad from her pocket, writing quickly. This is my address. Come by at 7 tonight. My son will be there with the boxes. Thank you. I can't tell you how helpful this could be. Just find the truth. Ms. Reynolds. Arthur tried for years, but no one would listen to one town engineer against Blackwood Chemical. As Maggie carefully photographed the utility maps for her records, her phone vibrated with an incoming text from Carol. Urgent, call secure line ASAP. Finding a private corner of the library, Maggie dialed Carol's number. What's happened? Your office was broken into last night, Carol said without preamble. Nothing obvious taken, but definitely searched. And Zoe didn't show up for work today. A cold certainty settled in Maggie's stomach. The warning about not trusting my assistant gets worse. I had our contact at the firm run that deep background check. Zoe Harris has only existed on paper for 3 years. Before that, nothing. A plant, Maggie concluded, the pieces falling into place. But working for whom? Blackwood, a competitor, someone else with interest in Silver Creek. No way to know yet, but it means she had access to everything: client communications, strategy notes, witness lists. Maggie thought quickly. Revising plans. I need to accelerate the investigation before anything else gets compromised. I found the actual drainage system used for BW-17 disposal, and I'm meeting with a potential witness tonight who may have documentation. Be careful, Mags. This is escalating fast. I know, but we're close to something big. I can feel it. After ending the call, Maggie gathered her materials and left the library, acutely aware of being watched. Not just paranoia, a black sedan had been parked across the street when she arrived, and remained there now, its windows tinted too darkly to see the occupants. She walked casually to her rental car, taking an indirect route back to her hotel. The sedan followed at a discreet distance, not trying to hide its presence, but rather making sure she knew she was being monitored. A warning or intimidation. Either way, it confirmed she was on the right track. Something in Silver Creek's past was valuable enough, dangerous enough to warrant active surveillance. At her hotel, Maggie implemented the security protocols she'd established after the previous incident, checking for signs of entry, using basic counter-surveillance measures, communicating only through secure channels. Then she began preparing for the evening meeting with the Fentons, organizing her questions about the northern drainage system and Blackwood's historical infrastructure. Her phone rang the hotel room's landline, not her cell. Few people knew she was staying here under an assumed name. Cautiously, she answered. "Ms. Reynolds." Richard Blackwood's voice was tense, urgent. "I believe you may be in danger. Franklin Pierce has discovered our meeting and the letter I shared with you. He's taken independent action." "What kind of independent action?" "I'm not certain of specifics, but he's made calls to people outside normal company channels, former security personnel, people with certain skills." A pause. "People who've handled problems quietly for Blackwood in the past? Are you saying your COO has hired people to intimidate me? Or worse, I'm saying Franklin believes he's protecting the company from what he sees as my naivety. He was my father's closest confidant. Whatever happened with BW-17, he was almost certainly involved." Maggie processed this, connecting it with the surveillance, the office break-in, possibly even the hotel incident. "Why are you warning me?" "Because this isn't how Blackwood should operate. Not under my leadership." His voice hardened. "And because Franklin doesn't understand that covering up past mistakes only compounds them. I appreciate the warning, Mr. Blackwood, but I won't be intimidated away from this investigation. I didn't expect you would be. Just take precautions. And Ms. Reynolds, whatever you discover about my father's decisions, remember that the company exists as more than his legacy now. Thousands of families depend on Blackwood for their livelihoods. The implied request was clear: pursue justice, but consider the broader impact on the community." "I'll remember," she said simply, and ended the call. Maggie sat motionless for several minutes, evaluating this new development. Richard Blackwood had just warned her about potential threats from his own company's COO, an extraordinary breach of corporate solidarity. Either he was genuinely concerned for her safety and committed to uncovering the truth, or this was an elaborate good cop, bad cop routine designed to manipulate her approach to the case. Her instincts leaned toward the former, but decades of legal practice had taught her caution. Actions spoke louder than words. She would watch what Richard actually did in the coming days, not just what he said. For now, though, she had a meeting to prepare for, one that could potentially provide crucial evidence about Blackwood Chemical's historical disposal practices and their connection to Silver Creek's unusual cancer patterns. As evening approached, Maggie checked her watch, gathered her materials, and performed one final security sweep of her room. Whether Richard's warning was genuine or manipulative, she would proceed with heightened vigilance. Too much was at stake for the Silver Creek residents, for her case, and potentially for her own safety to do otherwise. The black sedan still waited outside when she left the hotel, its presence now an overt statement rather than mere surveillance. Maggie took a photo of its license plate before driving toward her meeting with the Fentons, preparing herself for whatever revelations and risks the evening might bring. The Fenton home sat on a quiet street of modest ranch-style houses built during Silver Creek's boom years in the 1960s. Well-maintained gardens and American flags suggested a neighborhood of long-term residents, people who had built entire lives in the shadow of the Blackwood facility visible on the horizon. As Maggie parked, she noted the black sedan was no longer following her. Either she had lost them with her indirect route, or they had simply established her destination and withdrawn. Mrs. Fenton answered the door promptly at 7, ushering Maggie into a living room that displayed decades of family history through carefully arranged photographs. A middle-aged man rose from an armchair, James Fenton, the librarian's son, who had brought the requested records from the attic. "Thank you both for meeting with me," Maggie began, accepting the offered seat. "Your father's documentation could be extremely valuable to understanding what happened at Blackwood Chemical during the critical period we're investigating." James nodded solemnly. Dad always said the truth would matter someday. He kept everything organized by year and project. He gestured to several cardboard boxes stacked beside the coffee table. These cover 1975 through 1980, the years he had the most concerns about Blackwood's operations. For the next hour, Maggie carefully examined Arthur Fenton's meticulous records inspection reports, correspondence with state regulatory agencies, detailed notes on infrastructure projects, and most significantly, a journal documenting his growing concerns about water quality downstream from Blackwood's northern drainage output. April 18, 1977, water testing from collection point NR3 shows abnormal pH levels and chemical residue inconsistent with reported production waste. When questioned, Blackwood representatives claimed a one-time equipment cleaning procedure, requested follow-up testing denied by town manager Wilson, citing budget constraints. June 22, 1977, third instance of equipment cleaning in 2 months. Visible chemical residue along creek bank approximately 400 yards downstream from northern outflow. Documented with photographs, see envelope 77C. Requested formal EPA involvement. Request denied by Mayor's office. September 8, 1977, anonymous call from Blackwood employee regarding regular midnight disposal through northern system. Informant refused to identify himself but claimed to work in Building 7. Mentioned chemical designated BW17 being dumped when no one's watching. Attempted to raise issue at town council meeting. Item removed from agenda at last minute. The journal continued, documenting Arthur Fenton's increasingly frustrated attempts to address the contamination issue through official channels, all systematically blocked by town officials with connections to Blackwood Chemical. Most damning was a memo dated March 20, 1978, just days after William Marshall's hospitalization for chemical burns, in which Arthur documented a late-night inspection of the creek bank where he collected samples of an oily residue. He had sent these samples to a former colleague at the State Environmental Lab, circumventing local authorities. The lab results, stapled to the memo, identified multiple industrial solvents, including one the lab couldn't precisely identify but noted as bearing chemical signatures consistent with advanced degreasing agents, highly chlorinated, potentially carcinogenic. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Maggie said, carefully photographing the documents. Direct evidence linking Blackwood's northern drainage system to toxic chemical disposal during the exact time frame when BW17 was being produced. Mrs. Fenton nodded sadly. Arthur tried so hard to get someone to listen. Eventually, they forced him into early retirement, claimed budget cuts, but we all knew the real reason. Did he ever take these findings to federal authorities, the EPA or FBI? He tried, James replied. But this was during the Reagan years. The EPA had been gutted. His contact there said without local cooperation and more definitive evidence, they couldn't justify an investigation of the region's largest employer. And then people started getting sick, Mrs. Fenton added quietly. First just a few unusual cases, then more and more as the years passed. By the time the pattern became clear, it was the 1990s. Edward Blackwood had died. Richard had taken over and implemented all those new environmental safeguards. Everyone wanted to believe the problem was fixed, that the past could stay buried. Like so many who got sick, James said bitterly. Maggie carefully returned the documents to their folders. With your permission, I'd like to take these boxes with me. They provide crucial evidence for our case. Take them, Mrs. Fenton said firmly. Arthur kept them all these years so that someday someone would use them to find the truth. I think he'd be pleased that day has finally come. As they loaded the boxes into Maggie's car, a pair of headlights turned onto the street, moving slowly, a vehicle driving without purpose, simply observing. You should go inside, Maggie told the Fentons quietly. And if anyone asks, you never spoke with me. Mrs. Fenton straightened, a flash of defiance in her eyes. I'm not afraid anymore. Too many people in this town have been afraid for too long. That's how they got away with it. I understand, but my priority is keeping my witnesses safe while we build this case. Maggie closed her trunk. I'll be in touch once we've fully reviewed these records. As she drove away, Maggie checked her rearview mirror. The vehicle had stopped near the Fentons' house, its occupants clearly visible now as two men in dark clothing. They weren't bothering to hide their surveillance anymore, which meant whatever had been set in motion was approaching its critical phase. She needed to get Arthur Fenton's records somewhere secure, then determine her next steps. The evidence was mounting BW-17's toxicity, deliberate improper disposal, corporate knowledge, and active suppression of concerns. Combined with the health data she'd already compiled, they were building a compelling case for causation between Blackwood Chemicals' historical operations and Silver Creek's cancer clusters. But someone was equally determined to prevent that case from ever reaching court. The question was, who was giving the orders? Franklin Pierce, protecting both the company and his own historical involvement. Someone else within Blackwood with a vested interest in keeping the past buried? Or was Richard Blackwood playing an elaborate double game, appearing to help while actually orchestrating the interference? Maggie's instincts still favored Richard's sincerity, but she couldn't afford to trust those instincts blindly. Too much was at stake for her clients, for the Silver Creek community, and increasingly, for her own safety. As she navigated the quiet streets toward her hotel, a new vehicle appeared in her mirrors, the black sedan from earlier. No longer maintaining a discreet distance, but actively closing the gap between them. Maggie accelerated slightly, taking a different route than planned. The sedan matched her speed, then increased it, clearly intending to intercept her. This was no longer surveillance, it was pursuit. Her mind raced through options. The police unlikely to respond quickly enough, and potentially compromised given Blackwood's influence in the town. Her hotel too isolated, and her room could easily be accessed. What she needed was witnesses, public space, safety in numbers. She made a quick decision, turning toward downtown Silver Creek, where a community festival was underway. Streets filled with people, food vendors, local musicians performing on a small stage. She parked hastily, grabbed her purse and phone, and left the case files locked in her trunk. The sedan pulled up half a block away, and two men emerged, the same ones who had been watching the Fentons' house. They scanned the area, spotted her, and began moving purposefully through the crowd. Maggie blended into the festival, using the gathering of locals to obscure her movements while she called Carol. I need help, she said without preamble when Carol answered. I've got Arthur Fenton's records. They confirm everything about BW-17 disposal and the cover-up. But I've also got two men actively pursuing me through downtown Silver Creek. Where exactly are you? I'll call the local police. No police yet. Blackwood has too much influence here. I need a secure extraction, someone who can get me and these records safely back to Cincinnati. I'll make calls. The firm has security contractors for situations like this. Stay in public spaces, keep moving, and keep your phone on. Hurry, Maggie urged, glimpsing one of the men approximately 30 feet away, scanning the crowd methodically. I don't think they're just trying to scare me anymore. She ended the call and continued moving through the festival, maintaining awareness of her pursuers while attempting to appear casual. Years of high-stakes litigation had taught her to function under pressure, to think clearly even when adrenaline coursed through her system. What she needed was a temporary sanctuary somewhere public enough to deter direct confrontation, but secure enough to wait for Carol's extraction team. The Silver Creek Public Library was 2 blocks away, likely still open for the festival. Libraries had security cameras, staff, multiple exits. It was her best option. As she changed direction toward the library, her phone vibrated with an incoming text. On way. 20 minutes, hold position somewhere public. See, 20 minutes. She could manage that, assuming the men didn't. A hand closed around her upper arm, firm but not painful. "Ms. Reynolds," a male voice said quietly, "you need to come with us." Maggie turned to face a man in his 40s, military bearing, close-cropped hair, eyes that evaluated rather than threatened. "I don't think I do," she replied calmly, aware of the festival goers flowing around them, none paying particular attention to what appeared to be a normal conversation. "This isn't a request. Certain parties are concerned about your activities in Silver Creek. And those parties sent you to do what? Exactly intimidate me? Harm me? Neither seems wise in the middle of a public festival." His expression didn't change. "Just a conversation. Private, but civil. Then you leave town and pursue your investigation through proper channels." "I am using proper channels. If Blackwood Chemical has concerns about my investigation, they can address them through their legal counsel." The man's grip tightened slightly. "This isn't coming from official Blackwood channels, Ms. Reynolds. This is coming from people who've protected the company's interests for decades. People who understand that some matters are best handled quietly." The second man appeared on her other side, creating a loose but effective containment. "Cars waiting 2 blocks east," he informed his partner. "Clear path." Maggie assessed her options rapidly. Creating a scene might draw immediate help from bystanders, but could also escalate the situation unpredictably. Attempting to physically break away was unlikely to succeed against two trained men. Her best chance was to keep them talking until either an opportunity presented itself or Carol's team arrived. "Before I go anywhere with you," she said, "I'd like to know who exactly is giving the orders. Franklin Pierce or someone else at Blackwood?" A flicker of surprise crossed the first man's face. "You know more than you should. All the more reason for our conversation. Ms. Reynolds." A new voice, familiar, authoritative, cut through their exchange. Richard Blackwood stood several feet away, his presence commanding immediate attention. Behind him were two men whose alert postures and positioning suggested security training. "I believe you were heading to the library," Richard continued, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard as they fixed on the men flanking Maggie. "My security team would be happy to escort you." The first man released Maggie's arm, his expression tightening. "Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected. Is it? I thought I made my position clear yesterday. Mr. Kellen, Blackwood Chemical does not employ intimidation tactics against legal representatives conducting legitimate investigations. With all due respect, sir, there are aspects of this situation you don't fully understand." "On the contrary," Richard replied, his voice hardening, "I understand perfectly. Certain long-standing arrangements made under previous leadership are being continued without my knowledge or approval. That ends tonight." The tension between them was palpable: old guard versus new, shadows versus transparency, history versus future. Finally, Kellen nodded, a gesture of temporary retreat rather than submission. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood, but this matter extends beyond your authority, whether you recognize that yet or not." He and his partner withdrew, moving purposefully through the crowd until they disappeared from view. Richard approached Maggie, genuine concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, heart rate gradually slowing as the immediate threat receded. "Though I have to admit, your timing is impeccable. Not entirely coincidental. After our phone conversation, I had my personal security team monitor certain individuals I suspected might act independently." He gestured toward the library. "Shall we? It's more private, and I believe we have matters to discuss." As they walked, flanked discreetly by Richard's security personnel, Maggie studied him with new consideration. He had just openly opposed whatever shadow operation had existed within his company, potentially putting himself at odds with long-established power structures. "Those men," she said quietly, "they weren't just random thugs. They were professionals, connected to Blackwood somehow." Richard nodded grimly. Blackwood Chemical, like many large corporations with government contracts, has maintained relationships with various security specialists over the decades. Most of those relationships are legitimate, properly documented. Some, I'm discovering, are not, and Franklin Pierce authorized this operation. I believe so, though he would never leave a direct trail. Franklin represents the old Blackwood, my father's approach to problems. They reached the library, which remained open for the festival. Richard's security team positioned themselves near the entrance, while he and Maggie found a quiet corner in the local history section, ironically, the same room where she had discovered the utility maps earlier that day. "I've found evidence, Mr. Blackwood," Maggie said without preamble. "Definitive documentation of BW-17 disposal through the northern drainage system directly into Silver Creek, spanning years, not isolated incidents. Documentation of your father's knowledge of the toxicity of active suppression of concerns raised by town officials." She expected defensiveness, perhaps even a shift in his cooperative stance now that the evidence was becoming irrefutable. Instead, Richard's expression showed resignation, as if he had suspected this all along and was simply waiting for confirmation. "I found evidence as well," he replied. "My father's private safe in his old office. It contained health monitoring data for Building 7 workers from 1976 to 1983. Data showing elevated liver enzymes, unusual cancer rates, respiratory issues, all tracked privately, never reported to workers or regulators." The admission stunned Maggie. CEOs simply didn't volunteer damaging information like this, not without immunity agreements, not without extensive negotiations through legal channels. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because this stops now," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of a man making a fundamental moral choice. "The deception, the cover-up, the shadow operations, all of it. My father made decisions that harm people. People in this town, people who trusted the Blackwood name. These revelations could destroy your company," Maggie pointed out. "The liability alone could be substantial," he acknowledged, "but continuing to hide the truth will destroy something more important, the possibility of making this right, of being a company this town can trust again, can build a future with." Maggie studied him carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or ulterior motive. She found only resolve and what appeared to be genuine regret for actions he hadn't personally taken, but had inherited responsibility for. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood?" "Full disclosure. Comprehensive health screening for all current and former employees who may have been exposed. Medical trust funds for affected families. Environmental remediation of all contaminated areas." He met her gaze directly. "Negotiated through proper legal channels, with independent oversight, no matter the cost." Before Maggie could respond, her phone vibrated with an incoming text from Carol. "Team outside library, black SUV, north entrance. My extraction team has arrived," she told Richard. "Colleagues concerned about my safety after I reported being followed." He nodded. "You should go with them. It's not safe for you to stay in Silver Creek tonight, not until I've contained the situation with Franklin and his resources. And the evidence I've collected. Take it, use it. I'll provide access to whatever additional documentation we uncover internally." He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "I meant what I said. Ms. Reynolds, I want the truth exposed and addressed, not buried for another generation to discover." As Richard's security team escorted them to the library's north entrance, Maggie felt the weight of the case shifting, no longer simply an environmental liability investigation, but something more complex, more human, a story about generations, about responsibility inherited and choices made, about a community and company whose histories were too intertwined to separate. Outside, Carol's security contractors waited beside a black SUV, professional and alert. After confirming their identities, Maggie turned to Richard one last time. "I'll be in touch through official channels to discuss next steps," she said. "In the meantime, be careful. Whatever system your father put in place has operated independently for a long time. They won't relinquish control easily. I'm aware, he replied grimly. But Blackwood Chemical is my responsibility now. I'll handle Franklin and the old guard. As the SUV pulled away from Silver Creek, Maggie watched the town recede in the rear window, the festival lights, the historic buildings, and in the distance, the illuminated Blackwood Chemical facility standing tall against the night sky. A company town facing its reckoning after decades of silence. Her phone rang, Carol calling for an update. I'm safe, Maggie reported, and I have the evidence we need. Arthur Fenton's records confirm everything about BW-17 disposal and the cover-up. Thank God, Blackwood. Was he behind the intimidation attempt? No, Maggie said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. In fact, he intervened to stop it. It's more complicated than we thought. Carol, Richard Blackwood appears to be genuinely committed to exposing and addressing what his father did. You believe him? Carol's skepticism was evident. Maggie considered the question carefully, weighing Richard's actions against her decades of experience with corporate deception. I think I do, she admitted finally. He's provided evidence against his own company's interests, opposed internal forces trying to maintain the cover-up, and proposed comprehensive remediation. Either it's the most elaborate corporate manipulation I've ever encountered, or he's actually trying to do the right thing, Carol finished. Well, that would be a first in our experience. Yes, it would. As the SUV continued towards Cincinnati and the safety of her firm's resources, Maggie began mentally outlining the case that was taking shape no longer a straightforward corporate liability action, but a complex story of historical decisions, institutional secrecy, and the possibility of genuine corporate accountability. The road ahead would be challenging. Franklin Pierce and others invested in maintaining Blackwood's secrets would resist exposure. The legal complexities of establishing causation between decades-old chemical exposure and current health issues would require sophisticated scientific evidence. But for the first time since beginning the Silver Creek investigation, Maggie felt something unexpected alongside her professional determination hope. Hope that this case might not only deliver justice for the affected families, but also chart a new course for how corporations addressed historical environmental harms. She opened her laptop, beginning to organize the day's evidence while the security team drove through the night. There was much work to be done, risks still to be navigated, but the path forward was clearer now. The truth about Silver Creek and Blackwood Chemical was finally emerging from decades of silence, and Maggie Reynolds would ensure it was heard. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Maggie's Cincinnati office, illuminating the evidence spread across her conference table. Arthur Fenton's meticulous records formed the foundation town engineering documents, water testing results, correspondence with regulatory agencies, and his detailed personal journal tracking the systematic dismissal of his environmental concerns. Beside them lay the letter from Edward Blackwood to his research director, acknowledging BW-17's troubling health effects while directing their concealment, and most damning, the health monitoring data Richard had provided from his father's private safe evidence of a corporate leader tracking the poisoning of his workers while denying them knowledge of the risk. Carol entered, carrying fresh coffee and a grim expression. Franklin Pierce has made his move. What happened? Maggie asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Emergency board meeting called at Blackwood Chemical this morning. The official reason is leadership concerns, but our source says Pierce is attempting to suspend Richard's authority, claiming he's compromised the company's legal position by providing evidence to opposing counsel. Maggie absorbed this development. Can he succeed? Possibly. Richard holds significant shares, but Pierce has aligned with several other board members. They're invoking a rarely used bylaw allowing temporary leadership transition during periods of impaired judgment by the CEO. Impaired judgment, Maggie repeated with bitter irony, also known as developing a conscience. There's more, Carol continued. Jefferson Hayes has withdrawn as Blackwood's counsel, citing irreconcilable strategic differences with certain members of leadership. This was unexpected. Jefferson had represented Blackwood Chemical for decades. His career and reputation intertwined with the company's success. He called you directly, Carol nodded. This morning, wouldn't elaborate, but said to tell you he's chosen a side in this fight, and it isn't Franklin's. Whatever that means. Maggie considered the implications. Jefferson withdrawing represented another fracture in Blackwood's old guard, a significant one given his historical knowledge and influence. We need to accelerate our timeline, she decided. If Pierce succeeds in sidelining Richard, we'll lose our access to internal documentation and potentially face increased resistance. I want formal deposition notices issued today for both Richard and Franklin, and let's request an emergency conference with Judge Harlow to address the intimidation attempts. Carol made notes. What about Richard? Should we warn him about Pierce's maneuver? Maggie hesitated. While her instincts increasingly trusted Richard's intentions, maintaining appropriate boundaries remained essential. No direct contact, but make sure our press statement mentioning his cooperation is released this afternoon as planned. That should make it harder for Pierce to justify removing him for impaired judgment when the cooperation is already public. As Carol left to implement these directives, Maggie turned back to the evidence, focusing now on establishing the scientific connection between BW17 exposure and the specific cancer patterns in Silver Creek. The technical challenge was substantial. Linking decades-old chemical exposure to current health outcomes required both compelling scientific evidence and legal arguments that could overcome statute of limitations defenses. Her phone rang a number she didn't recognize. Reynolds, she answered cautiously. Ms. Reynolds, this is Dr. Harrison Mills. The name registered immediately. The research director addressed in Edward Blackwood's damning letter about BW17. Dr. Mills, she replied, keeping her tone neutral while adrenaline surged through her system. This is unexpected. Yes. Well, his voice carried the slight tremor of advanced age. I understand from this morning's news that you're investigating Blackwood Chemical's historical operations, specifically regarding BW17. That's correct. I've been retired for 18 years. Ms. Reynolds thought I'd left Blackwood behind. A heavy sigh. But some matters refuse to stay buried. It seems. Do you have information relevant to our investigation? Doctor, I was research director for Blackwood Chemical from 1969 to 1997. I developed BW17. The statement was direct, almost clinical in its delivery. And I've been carrying the weight of that creation for 47 years. Maggie reached for her recorder, activating it with practiced movements. Dr. Mills, would you be willing to provide a formal statement regarding BW17's development and what you knew about its health effects? That's why I'm calling. It's time for the truth. A pause, but not over the phone. I have documentation, research records, internal communications, the original toxicity studies. If you want them, come to my home. Today. After arranging details and ensuring Carol dispatched security to accompany her, Maggie contemplated this unexpected development. Dr. Harrison Mills wasn't just any potential witness. He was the scientist who had created the chemical compound at the center of their case, who had corresponded directly with Edward Blackwood about its toxic effects. His testimony could be the linchpin that connected all elements of their case. Dr. Mills lived in a modest suburban home 40 minutes outside Cincinnati, its well-tended gardens suggesting a peaceful retirement far removed from corporate chemical research. At 83, he moved slowly but with purpose, his mind evidently undiminished by age. I've been waiting for this day, he said after settling in his study, where boxes of documents sat prepared, watching the cancer statistics from Silver Creek for decades, knowing but never speaking. Why now? Maggie asked gently. I'm dying. Ms. Reynolds. Pancreatic cancer. He smiled grimly at the irony. Not BW17 related, just the ordinary tragedy of aging. But it concentrates the mind wonderfully, facing one's creator with unresolved sins. He gestured to the boxes. Everything is there, the complete history of BW17 from inception to discontinuation. Laboratory notebooks, correspondence, test results, the entire shameful chronicle. Maggie began reviewing the materials as Dr. Mills narrated their significance, piecing together the story of a promising industrial solvent whose development took a darker turn. We knew by late 1976 that BW17 was problematic, he explained, indicating specific laboratory reports. Initial animal studies showed liver and kidney damage at exposure levels we couldn't guarantee wouldn't occur in industrial settings. I recommended reformulation or abandonment of the compound. But that didn't happen, Maggie observed. No, Edward overruled me. BW17 was significantly more effective than competing products, potentially worth millions in contracts. He ordered limited production to continue while we sought solutions. Mill's hands trembled slightly. What I didn't know then was that he had also authorized a separate health monitoring program for workers exposed to the compound. Without informing them of the risk, Maggie added, precisely, they became unwitting test subjects. Their blood work, medical exams, all tracked centrally but never disclosed. He indicated a folder of medical data. By 1978, the pattern was clear: elevated liver enzymes, cellular changes consistent with precancerous conditions. I confronted Edward directly. And his response, he agreed to phase out production, but insisted on continued use of existing stockpiles. Most critically, he refused to implement costly proper disposal procedures for the remaining compound. That's when the midnight dumping began. Dr. Mills described a systematic operations security personnel, ensuring Building 7 was cleared of regular workers during third shift. Maintenance crews directed to flush BW17 and its manufacturing byproducts directly into the northern drainage system. Records falsified to show proper disposal through approved channels. I objected strenuously, he said, his voice hollow with remembered futility. Edward reminded me of my confidentiality agreements, the company's financial position, the jobs that would be lost if Blackwood faced regulatory penalties. He assured me the dilution in the waterway would render the chemical harmless. But you knew better, Maggie said softly. I did. BW17 was designed for persistence. That's what made it effective as a degreasing agent. It wouldn't break down in water. It would accumulate in soil, in plant tissue, in human bodies. He met her eyes directly. I knew, and I remained silent. For that, there is no excuse. For the next 2 hours, Maggie methodically documented Dr. Mills' testimony, correlating his statements with the evidence he provided. His account aligned perfectly with Arthur Fenton's records, filling the scientific gaps the town engineer couldn't address. There's one more thing, Dr. Mills said as they concluded. Something not in these records. Something few people knew. What is it? Edward's wife, Richard's mother, worked briefly in administration at Building 7 during early BW17 development. She died in 1972 of what was diagnosed as cardiac failure, but exhibited liver abnormalities consistent with what we later identified as BW17 exposure effects. Maggie absorbed this revelation with shock. Are you suggesting Edward Blackwood knew his wife's death might have been connected to BW17? I don't know what Edward knew for certain, but after her death, he became obsessed with understanding BW17's health impacts, hence the secret monitoring program. Yet he continued production, continued improper disposal, continued risking other lives. Mills shook his head slowly. I've often wondered if guilt drove his determination to make the product successful, as if its financial success could somehow justify her loss. This personal dimension added a new layer of complexity to the case, a potential explanation for Edward Blackwood's contradictory behavior, tracking health impacts while continuing to expose workers in the community. Not simple corporate greed, but a twisted rationalization born of grief and guilt. Does Richard know about this connection? Maggie asked. I doubt it. Edward was careful to separate his wife's medical records from the monitoring program. Her death predated Richard's involvement with the company by many years. Mills looked troubled. Perhaps he should know. It might help him understand his father's actions, conflicted as they were. As Maggie prepared to leave with the documented testimony and evidence, Dr. Mills gripped her hand with surprising strength. Use this to make it right, Miss Reynolds, for Silver Creek, for the workers, for all of us who remained silent too long. I will, she promised. And Dr. Mills, your testimony will matter. Coming forward now doesn't erase the past, but it does serve justice. A faint smile crossed his lined face. Small comfort, but I'll take it. Better late than never to find one's courage. The law offices of Hayes & Associates occupied a stately building in downtown Cincinnati, its traditional architecture reflecting Jefferson Hayes's reputation for stability and professional longevity. Maggie hadn't expected his call inviting her to meet, especially after his withdrawal as Blackwood Chemicals counsel just hours earlier. His assistant escorted her directly to his private office, where Jefferson waited beside a table laid with what appeared to be afternoon tea, an old habit from his years representing British corporate clients. Maggie, he greeted her, his voice carrying the weight of their 30-year professional acquaintance. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Your withdrawal from Blackwood made this meeting too intriguing to decline, she replied, accepting the offered seat. Though I'm not sure we should be meeting without other counsel present, given our opposing positions in this matter. Former opposing positions, he corrected, pouring tea with practiced movements. My representation of Blackwood Chemical ended officially at 10:17 this morning. Why? Maggie asked directly. You've represented them for decades. Jefferson considered his response carefully. There comes a point in every attorney's career when they must choose between representing a client's expressed interests and enabling behavior that contradicts their own ethical boundaries. Franklin Pierce's tactics. Among other concerns, he set down his cup. I've spent my career defending corporations. Maggie, I believe in their right to operate without excessive regulatory burden, to advocate for favorable legal interpretations, to vigorously contest allegations. But what happened in Silver Creek, what I've learned, was deliberately concealed for decades, crosses lines I cannot defend. And yet you defended them for years during which this concealment was ongoing. So without knowledge of what was being concealed, he countered, there's a difference between zealous representation and complicity in covering up public health hazards. Something in his expression suggested personal rather than merely professional concern. Maggie studied him more carefully. There's more to this decision than professional ethics, isn't there? Jeff. He hesitated, then reached for a silver-framed photograph on his desk, a woman in her 60s, smiling beside Jefferson on what appeared to be a vacation beach. My wife, Eleanor, grew up in Silver Creek, 2 blocks from the creek itself, diagnosed with a rare form of kidney cancer 3 years ago, the same variant appearing with unusual frequency among long-term Silver Creek residents. Understanding dawned. I'm sorry, Jefferson, I didn't know. Few do. We've kept her condition private. He replaced the photograph carefully. But when Richard Blackwood began raising questions about historical contamination, when your investigation started uncovering patterns that aligned with Eleanor's medical history, I could no longer compartmentalize my professional role from my personal reality. How is she now? In remission, thankfully, but the treatment was brutal. The prognosis remains uncertain, and the question of cause haunts us. His expression hardened. Especially now that I've seen evidence suggesting Blackwood executives knew about risks to the community decades ago. Maggie absorbed this revelation. Jefferson Hayes, long considered an immovable pillar of corporate defense, had experienced a fundamental shift in perspective through personal connection to the case. What happens now, she asked. Your withdrawal leaves Blackwood in a precarious legal position. They've already engaged Winthrop and Stern as replacement counsel. Franklin made sure of that. Jefferson leaned forward. But that's not why I asked you here. I have information you should know. He slid a folder across the table inside were board meeting minutes from Blackwood Chemical, dating from 1978 to 1983 with certain passages highlighted. These document the board of directors' knowledge of BW-17 disposal practices, Jefferson explained. Not just Edward Blackwood's unilateral decisions, but formal board approval of what they euphemistically called alternative waste management protocols to avoid regulatory costs. Maggie scanned the highlighted sections, their clinical corporate language masking the reality of deliberate toxic dumping. How did you obtain these? They were in sealed portions of the corporate record, marked for attorney-client privilege review. As counsel, I had access. He met her questioning look directly. Yes, I'm aware of the ethical implications of sharing them. I've made my peace with that decision. The minutes expanded their case significantly, establishing that responsibility extended beyond Edward Blackwood to the entire governance structure of the company during that period. And notably, one name appeared consistently among those present, Franklin Pierce. Then a rising executive being groomed for leadership. Franklin was directly involved in these decisions, Maggie observed. No wonder he's fighting so aggressively to maintain control now. This isn't just about corporate liability, it's personal culpability. Precisely. Franklin isn't merely protecting Blackwood Chemical, he's protecting himself. As the last remaining executive from that era, he would face particular scrutiny in any investigation. Jefferson's expression was grave. And he knows it. These minutes are likely privilege, Maggie noted. Difficult to use directly in court. True, but they tell you where to look, what to request through proper channels, which witnesses to depose. Jefferson paused. And they provide context for understanding what Richard is facing internally. You believe Richard is genuinely trying to address the company's historical wrongs? I do. I've known Richard since he joined Blackwood, watched him evolve from a young executive following his father's playbook to a leader increasingly questioning that inheritance. Jefferson's voice carried the weight of long observation. This crisis has forced him to confront the darkest aspects of that inheritance directly. As their meeting concluded, Jefferson walked Maggie to the door, their professional rivalry temporarily transformed by shared concern for justice. One last thing, he said quietly. Be careful with Franklin. He's not just a corporate executive protecting company interests. He was Edward Blackwood's right hand, the executor of his most controversial decisions. There are rumors he maintains connections with security contractors who've handled sensitive matters for Blackwood over the decades. The men who confronted me in Silver Creek, Maggie concluded, likely, yes, and they represent merely the visible element of resources he might deploy when truly desperate. After leaving Hayes and Associates, Maggie called Carol from her car, updating her on this significant development while navigating afternoon traffic. Jefferson Hayes turning against Blackwood, Carol marveled. Never thought I'd see the day. Personal connection changes perspective, Maggie replied. His wife's illness made Silver Creek's cancer clusters more than abstract statistics. How do we use this? The board minutes are almost certainly privileged. We use them as a roadmap, not evidence. They tell us exactly which former board members to depose, which corporate records to request. Maggie paused at a traffic light, and they confirm Franklin Pierce's central role in the cover-up. He's not just defending corporate interests, he's defending himself from potential criminal liability. Speaking of Franklin, Carol interjected, you should know the board meeting ended an hour ago. According to our source, they've implemented a temporary leadership structure with Pierce as acting CEO while Richard's actions undergo review. So he succeeded, partially. Richard remains on the board, and several members expressed reservations about the extreme measure. It's a 30-day arrangement pending further evaluation. That gives Pierce a month to solidify control, destroy evidence, and undermine our case. Maggie observed grimly. We need to move faster. File for emergency preservation orders covering all Blackwood records, and schedule Richard's deposition immediately, before Pierce can legally prevent him from testifying openly. Already in progress. But Maggie, with Pierce in control, the security concerns escalate. These aren't just aggressive litigation tactics anymore. The men who confronted you in Silver Creek were prepared for something more dangerous than intimidation. I know, Maggie acknowledged, remembering their military precision, their implicit threats. Increased security at the firm and for our key witnesses. especially Dr. Mills. His testimony is crucial, and he's already in vulnerable health. After ending the call, Maggie drove toward her firm's offices, her mind processing the rapidly evolving case. What had begun as an investigation into corporate environmental liability had expanded into something far more complex, a multi-generational drama of power, guilt, responsibility, and now, potentially, redemption through Richard's efforts to confront his father's legacy. The legal challenges remain formidable, establishing causation between historical contamination and current health issues, overcoming statute of limitations defenses, addressing intervening causes and alternative explanations. But with each new piece of evidence, Arthur Fenton's records, Edward Blackwood's letter, Dr. Mill's testimony, the board minutes, the narrative grew more compelling, the pattern of corporate knowledge and concealment more difficult to dismiss. As she parked in the firm's garage, Maggie noticed a silver sedan she didn't recognize positioned near the elevator, too convenient to be coincidental. Her instincts, honed by decades of high-stakes litigation and recent security threats, registered immediate concern. She remained in her locked car, calling building security from her cell phone. "This is Margaret Reynolds. There's an unidentified vehicle positioned suspiciously near the executive elevator in Section C. Could you send someone to investigate?" While waiting for security to respond, Maggie observed a man emerge from the sedan, mid-30s, business casual attire, moving with purpose toward the elevator. Not visibly threatening, but deliberately positioned in her path. The security team arrived promptly, intercepting the man before he could reach the elevator. Their conversation appeared tense but controlled. After several minutes, they escorted him toward the building exit, rather than taking him into custody, suggesting he hadn't presented an immediate threat, but wasn't authorized to be in the secure parking area. Maggie waited until both the security team and the unidentified man had left before proceeding to the elevator, maintaining heightened awareness of her surroundings. Inside her office, she found Alexander Bennett, the firm's managing partner, waiting with Carol. "Your security concerns are escalating," Alexander stated without preamble. The man in the garage identified himself as a process server delivering documents for Franklin Pierce personally, not Blackwood Chemical, not their counsel, Pierce personally. "An unusual approach," Maggie noted. "What documents?" Carol handed her a thick envelope. "A cease and desist letter regarding your interference with Blackwood corporate governance, allegations of unethical communication with represented parties, and threats of bar complaints if you continue investigating certain historical aspects of Blackwood operations. All baseless," Alexander added, "but calculated to distract and intimidate. The real message is Pierce's willingness to make this personal rather than merely professional." Maggie scanned the documents, recognizing the aggressive tactics as a sign of desperation rather than legal confidence. "These won't stand up to scrutiny, but they'll consume resources to address. The firm will handle the responses," Alexander assured her. "Your focus should remain on the substantive case, but Maggie," his expression grew more serious, "we're implementing additional security protocols, restricted building access, security escorts for key personnel, encrypted communications only." "That's serious?" "We've received information suggesting Pierce has engaged non-standard resources to address what he terms the Reynolds problem." Alexander's diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the gravity of the threat. "The firm takes such threats against our attorneys extremely seriously." After Alexander departed, Maggie and Carol returned to case preparation, their workflow now adapted to heightened security concerns. The afternoon passed in focused activity preparing deposition outlines, drafting preservation orders, organizing scientific evidence linking BW17 exposure to specific health conditions. Maggie's phone rang, the secure line dedicated to witness communications. "Ms. Reynolds." Richard Blackwood's voice was tense, urgent. "I don't have much time. Pierce has implemented monitoring of all my communications through company channels." "I've heard about the board's decision," she replied cautiously. "I'm sorry about the temporary leadership change." It's not unexpected. Franklin has cultivated board relationships for decades. His voice lowered further. But that's not why I'm calling. There's something you need to know, something I discovered in my father's personal records after our last conversation. What is it? My mother's medical records. She died when I was 12 officially from heart failure, but these records show liver abnormalities consistent with chemical exposure. She worked in Building 7 administration during early BW-17 development. Maggie closed her eyes briefly. Dr. Mills' revelation now confirmed directly. I'm very sorry, Richard. It explains so much, he continued, voice tight with controlled emotion. My father's obsession with tracking BW-17 health effects while simultaneously expanding its production, his refusal to acknowledge the risk publicly, it was never just about corporate profits, it was about justifying a personal loss he couldn't face directly. This information doesn't change your position regarding the company's responsibility. It strengthens it. His response was immediate, resolute. Whatever complex emotions drove my father's decisions, the result was the same people were harmed. Silver Creek was contaminated. That responsibility now falls to me, regardless of Pierce's temporary control. Pierce will fight any attempt at transparency or accountability, Maggie warned. He's already taking aggressive action to impede our investigation. I know, he's locked down my access to historical records, removed my executive privileges, even restricted my movement within headquarters. A pause. But he doesn't know about the documentation I've already secured, including my father's personal journals, detailing his knowledge of contamination issues dating back to 1972. Those journals would be powerful evidence, Maggie acknowledged. But Richard, transferring them to me now would certainly violate the board's restrictions on your activities. I'm aware of the professional risk, he replied, but some matters transcend corporate protocols. I've arranged for secure delivery of the journals to your office tomorrow morning. They'll come through my personal attorney, not directly from me, to provide some buffer against Pierce's allegations of misconduct. The line went silent momentarily before Richard continued, his voice carrying new urgency. There's something else you should know. Franklin has scheduled an executive session with Blackwood's new counsel tomorrow. I'm not invited, but my sources indicate they're discussing settlement parameters for the Silver Creek claims. Settlement? Maggie was surprised. That's a significant shift from their previous position. Not a good faith settlement, Richard clarified. A strategic one. Minimal compensation contingent on confidentiality agreements that would permanently seal all evidence of historical knowledge and deliberate contamination. They're attempting to bury the truth under legal closure, without addressing the actual environmental remediation or long-term health monitoring, Maggie concluded. Exactly, and it's damage control, not accountability. The sound of a door opening interrupted him. I have to go. Remember, my father's journals arrive tomorrow. They contain everything you need to establish the timeline of knowledge and concealment. After the call ended, Maggie shared this development with Carol, their strategy discussions now encompassing both the forthcoming evidence and the need to prepare clients for potential settlement overtures designed to fragment their unified position. We should warn Aaron Marshall and the other plaintiffs, Carol suggested. Pierce may try to approach them individually with offers designed to seem generous while actually limiting the company's total exposure. Agreed. Schedule a client meeting for tomorrow afternoon. We'll brief them on the case progress and prepare them for potential divide-and-conquer tactics. As evening approached, Maggie reviewed their case development, the evidence mounting, the narrative strengthening, yet the obstacles growing proportionally as Franklin Pierce deployed increasingly aggressive countermeasures. Her secure phone rang again, an unfamiliar number. Reynolds, she answered cautiously. Ms. Reynolds, a female voice, elderly, distressed. This is Martha Mills, Harrison's wife. Harrison has been taken to University Hospital. He collapsed after your meeting. The doctors say, her voice broke, they say it's advanced, very advanced. He's asking to see you, says it's urgent. I'll come immediately, Maggie assured her. Which unit is he in? After noting the details and alerting security to accompany her, Maggie gathered essential case materials, Dr. Mill's condition had been serious during their meeting, but his collapse suggested a more rapid deterioration than expected. If he had additional information to share, it needed to be properly documented while he remained able to communicate. The drive to University Hospital was tense, Maggie's security detail maintaining vigilance against potential surveillance or intervention. The parking garage, hospital corridors, and elevator to Dr. Mills's floor were navigated with professional caution, a necessary adaptation to the reality that Franklin Pierce now viewed her investigation as a threat warranting extraordinary measures. Dr. Mills lay connected to monitoring equipment, his already thin frame diminished further by illness. Despite his condition, his eyes remained alert, focusing immediately when Maggie entered. "You came?" he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Good. There's something I didn't tell you. Something crucial." Martha Mills squeezed her husband's hand gently. "Harrison, the doctor said you need to rest." "No time for rest. My dear, not anymore." His gaze returned to Maggie. "The disposal records for BW-17. I told you about the northern drainage system, the midnight dumping operations. But there was more." Maggie moved closer, activating her recorder with Mrs. Mills' permission. "What else happened, Dr. Mills?" "When production ended in 1984, we still had significant BW-17 stockpiles, too expensive to dispose of properly through approved channels." His breathing labored slightly. "Edward authorized a one-time solution, 55-gallon drums, buried on Blackwood property." "Where exactly?" "The northeast section, undeveloped land bordering Silver Creek watershed. Approximately 200 drums, buried in clay-lined pits." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I supervised the technical aspects, ensuring the drums were properly sealed, the pits correctly prepared, but it was wrong. All wrong." "Do records of this disposal exist?" "No official records." Edward insisted on complete deniability, but I kept personal documentation, location maps, inventory lists, technical specifications of the containment system. He gestured weakly toward his wife. "Martha knows where?" Mrs. Mills nodded, retrieving a small key from her purse. "Safety deposit box at First National. Harrison showed me years ago. Said someday it might be needed to make things right." "Those drums," Dr. Mills continued urgently, "were designed for 20-year integrity. It's been 40 years. If they've degraded, if BW-17 has leached into the groundwater." He didn't need to complete the thought. The implications were clear: a continuing source of contamination, potentially affecting Silver Creek's water supply even now. "I'll request immediate testing of that area," Maggie assured him. "And with your documentation, we can compel Blackwood to excavate and properly dispose of any remaining material." "There's more." Dr. Mill's voice weakened further. "Richard's mother, Catherine. Her exposure wasn't incidental. She volunteered for the first human safety trial of BW-17. Edward didn't want to risk external testing that might attract regulatory attention." Maggie's shock must have been visible, for Dr. Mills nodded sadly. "Catherine believed in her husband's work, trusted his assurances about safety protocols. When she developed symptoms, Edward was devastated but couldn't acknowledge the connection publicly without admitting to unauthorized human testing. So he buried that truth along with her," Maggie observed quietly. "Yes, and with it, buried his own guilt beneath layers of rationalization and denial." Dr. Mills's expression reflected decades of carried secrets. "Richard deserves to know the full truth about his mother's death, not from case documents or depositions, but directly, compassionately." "I understand," Maggie said, recognizing both the legal significance of this revelation and its profound personal impact on Richard Blackwood. After gathering the specific information about the safety deposit box and ensuring Mrs. Mills had her contact details, Maggie prepared to leave. Dr. Mills gripped her hand with surprising strength for his condition. "Make it right," he whispered. "All of it. I will, she promised. And Dr. Mills, thank you for your courage in coming forward. It matters. Outside the hospital room, Maggie briefed her security team on their next destination, First National Bank, where Mrs. Mills had authorized her to access the safety deposit box containing crucial evidence about BW-17's buried stockpiles. The revelation about Catherine Blackwood's death added yet another layer to the already complex case, not just corporate negligence and environmental contamination, but potentially illegal human experimentation conducted by a husband on his wife, with devastating consequences that had shaped decades of subsequent decisions at Blackwood Chemical. As they navigated toward the bank, Maggie's mind processed the implications. Richard's discovery of his mother's true cause of death had clearly strengthened his determination to address the company's historical wrongs. Learning the full circumstances that she had been a deliberate test subject rather than an incidental exposure victim would likely intensify that commitment, regardless of Franklin Pierce's efforts to regain control of the narrative. The buried drums represented an immediate environmental concern, potentially still leaching BW-17 into the watershed 4 decades after their improper disposal. This required urgent attention beyond the historical liability issues, potentially invoking emergency remediation protocols under current environmental regulations. Maggie's phone rang, Carol calling with an update. "We have a problem," Carol said without preamble. "Dr. Mills's meeting with you has become known to Pierce somehow. Winthrop and Stern just filed an emergency motion seeking to exclude his testimony as impaired by medical condition and potentially coached by opposing counsel." "That's absurd," Maggie replied. "Dr. Mills approached us voluntarily, and his testimony has been properly documented under standard witness protocols. It's a delay tactic, but an effective one. Judge Harlow has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow morning to address their concerns before allowing the testimony to be formally entered into evidence." "Pierce is moving fast," Maggie observed. "He knows Mills' testimony is damaging, particularly regarding the direct board knowledge of contamination issues. There's more," Carol continued. "Our security team reports unusual activity near your apartment building. Nothing definitive, but consistent with surveillance preparation. We're recommending you use the firm's secure accommodation tonight instead of returning home." The escalation was concerning, but not entirely surprising. As their case strengthened, Pierce's desperation would naturally increase along with the measures he might authorize to protect himself and the company from exposure. "Agreed. And Carol, have someone check on Aaron Marshall and the other key plaintiffs. If Pierce knows about Mills, he may also be targeting other witnesses." After ending the call, Maggie turned her attention to the immediate task retrieving Dr. Mills's documentation about the buried BW-17 stockpiles. This evidence would prove crucial not only for their historical liability case, but also for addressing any ongoing environmental hazard the deteriorating drums might present. The bank's procedures were efficiently navigated with Mrs. Mills's authorization letter and appropriate identification. Inside the private viewing room, Maggie opened the safety deposit box to find meticulously organized materials, hand-drawn maps showing the exact locations of the buried drums, technical specifications of the containment systems, and most damning, a personal journal in which Dr. Mills had documented Edward Blackwood's direct orders regarding the secret disposal operation. April 12, 1984, Edward has authorized final disposition of remaining BW-17 stockpiles. Off the books. Harrison. No paper trail, no regulatory filings, no transportation manifests. When I expressed concern about potential future liability, he dismissed it. "By the time those drums could possibly degrade, we'll all be long gone. Future problems for future leadership." I objected strenuously but was overruled. The best I could negotiate was proper sealing and clay-lined pits to minimize immediate leaching. God forgive me for this compromise. I've marked the exact locations on a topographical map and included depth specifications. Perhaps someday this documentation will facilitate proper remediation when wiser minds prevail. Attached to the journal entry was a detailed map of northeastern Blackwood property, with 3 distinct burial sites marked and annotated with precise coordinates, depths, and the number of drums at each location. This evidence transformed a significant portion of their case from historical to immediate, the buried drums representing not just past misconduct, but potentially ongoing environmental contamination requiring urgent intervention. Maggie carefully documented and photographed all materials before returning them to the safety deposit box, ensuring chain of custody protocols were maintained for eventual court presentation. The originals would remain secured until formal evidence submission, while copies would drive immediate action on the potential continuing hazard. Outside the bank, dusk was settling over Cincinnati, the day's final light casting long shadows as Maggie and her security team moved toward their vehicle. The street was relatively quiet, most businesses closed. Few pedestrians present a vulnerability her security detail clearly recognized as they maintained closer positioning around her. "Ms. Reynolds." The voice came from behind them, measured and familiar. Turning, Maggie found herself facing Franklin Pierce, accompanied by a single assistant. At 70, Pierce remained imposing tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, his bearing reflecting decades of corporate authority. "Mr. Pierce," she acknowledged cautiously, her security personnel immediately adjusting their positioning. "This is unexpected, yet perhaps overdue." His tone was controlled, professional, revealing nothing of the aggressive legal and surveillance tactics he had apparently authorized. "I believe we have matters to discuss that would benefit from direct communication rather than through intermediaries. Any such discussion should occur through counsel, given the active litigation." Maggie replied evenly. "Winthrop and Stern can arrange appropriate channels." Pierce smiled thinly. "Winthrop and Stern represent Blackwood Chemical's interests as a corporation. This conversation concerns broader considerations." He gestured toward a black sedan parked nearby. 15 minutes of your time. Ms. Reynolds, unrecorded, no commitments required, simply an exchange of perspectives that might prove mutually beneficial." Every professional instinct warned against accepting such an irregular proposal, yet diplomatic engagement often revealed vulnerabilities and intentions that formal channels concealed. Understanding Pierce's direct perspective could provide strategic advantages for the case. 5 minutes, Maggie countered. "In public view, with my security present." Pierce considered this, then nodded toward a small park across the street, its benches visible from the sidewalk. "Acceptable." After instructing her security team to maintain visual contact while allowing private conversation, Maggie accompanied Pierce to the park bench, maintaining professional composure despite the extraordinary circumstances. "You've assembled compelling evidence," Pierce began without preamble. "Mill's testimony, Fenton's records, Edwards' private documentation, enough to establish historical liability for BW17 contamination. That's a significant concession from someone actively fighting our case," Maggie observed. "I'm a practical man, Mrs. Reynolds. When facts become sufficiently established, continuing denial serves no productive purpose." His expression remained impassive. "The question becomes how to address those facts in a manner that balances multiple legitimate interests, including your personal interest in avoiding accountability for your role in the decisions," Maggie suggested directly. If Pierce was surprised by her forthright approach, he didn't show it, including considerations of Silver Creek's economic future, which remains inextricably linked to Blackwood Chemical's continued operation. That connection doesn't justify concealing decades of environmental contamination and its health consequences. "No, it doesn't," Pierce agreed unexpectedly. "But it does justify seeking resolution that addresses historical harms while preserving the community's economic foundation." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Blackwood Chemical employs 37% of Silver Creek's workforce. Our tax base funds schools, infrastructure, public services. If litigation drives the company to bankruptcy or relocation, justice for historical victims will come at the cost of economic devastation for the entire community." "That's a false dichotomy," Maggie countered. Accountability and continued operation aren't mutually exclusive. Perhaps not in principle, but practically, Pierce shook his head. The liability exposure you're establishing potentially exceeds the company's insurance coverage and liquid assets combined. The board would have fiduciary obligations to consider reorganization, relocation, or dissolution if settlement parameters reach certain thresholds. His argument wasn't without merit. Corporate environmental cases often created this tension between justice for victims and broader community economic interests. But it also represented a sophisticated pressure tactic, attempting to position her pursuit of full accountability as potentially harmful to the very community she sought to help. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Pierce? A structured settlement framework, substantial compensation for affected families, medical monitoring programs, limited environmental remediation of highest priority areas? He maintained steady eye contact. In exchange for confidentiality provisions and release of historical liability claims. And the truth about what happened, the corporate knowledge, the deliberate contamination, the decades of concealment that simply disappears from public record. The truth serves no constructive purpose at this stage, Pierce replied with practiced reasonableness. It can't undo historical harms. It can only damage Blackwood's current operations and, by extension, Silver Creek's economic stability. Maggie studied him, this man who had spent decades protecting Blackwood's interests, who had participated in the very decisions that had poisoned a community, who now sought to manage the consequences through financial settlement rather than full accountability. The truth always matters, Mr. Pierce, not just for justice, but for prevention, without full disclosure of what happened and why. The patterns that allowed corporate interests to override public health remain unchallenged. Pierce's expression hardened slightly. A principled position, Ms. Reynolds. But principals don't provide paychecks to Silver Creek families when Blackwood operations cease. They don't fund the school system or maintain public infrastructure. Neither does concealing corporate misconduct, she countered. My clients deserve both compensation and truth. The community deserves to understand what happened and receive assurance it won't happen again. Then we find ourselves at an impasse. Pierce rose, signaling the end of their conversation. I had hoped for more pragmatism from someone with your experience, Ms. Reynolds. Not all battles can be won completely. Sometimes partial victories must suffice. This isn't about winning, Mr. Pierce. It's about accountability. A semantic distinction without practical difference. He straightened his already immaculate suit jacket. Consider my proposal. Discuss it with your clients. Remember that perfect justice for past harms may come at the cost of future stability for the very community you're defending. As he turned to leave, Maggie asked one final question. Does Richard know you're making this proposal? Pierce paused. Richard's temporary removal from leadership was necessary precisely because his personal guilt over his father's decisions clouded his judgment about the company's proper course. He's allowing emotional reconciliation to override fiduciary responsibility. Or perhaps he's demonstrating that corporate responsibility extends beyond financial statements to moral accountability. Maggie suggested, a philosophical luxury few public companies can afford. Pierce's tone suggested the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Good evening, Miss Reynolds. My offer remains open until Friday. After that, we proceed with full litigation defense and all that entails. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Continuing pursuit of the case would trigger escalated countermeasures beyond what they had already experienced. Yet Pierce had also revealed something valuable: recognition that their evidence was sufficiently compelling to warrant settlement consideration, rather than categorical denial. As Pierce departed and her security team rejoined her, Maggie processed the interaction. Pierce's settlement proposal represented classic damage control, financial compensation in exchange for sealed records, and confidentiality provisions that would prevent the full truth about Blackwood's historical actions from ever becoming public. For some clients, Such settlements made practical sense, providing needed compensation without years of litigation uncertainty. But this case had evolved beyond typical corporate environmental liability. It now involved potential criminal misconduct, deliberate public health endangerment, and decades of active concealment. The truth itself had become a central component of justice, not merely the financial compensation that might result from it. Returning to the secure vehicle, Maggie called Carol to update her on both Dr. Mills' buried drums evidence and the unexpected Pierce encounter. "He's getting desperate," Carol observed after hearing the details. "Offering settlement directly, outside counsel channels, suggests he's worried about what full litigation discovery might reveal about his personal involvement." "Agreed. And the buried drums change the equation significantly. If they're still leaching BW17 into the watershed, we're dealing with ongoing contamination, not just historical liability. That triggers different regulatory frameworks, potential emergency remediation orders, which would be public, not subject to confidential settlement," Carol concluded. "No wonder Pierce wants this resolved quietly." "Schedule environmental testing at those northeast locations immediately," Maggie directed. "Independent experts, proper chain of custody for samples, and file emergency motions for site preservation to prevent any attempt at removing evidence before testing can occur." As they drove toward the firm's secure accommodation, Maggie's thoughts turned to Richard Blackwood. His position had become increasingly precarious, temporarily removed from leadership, yet still holding crucial evidence about his father's actions. Now facing the additional revelation about his mother's death being directly connected to unauthorized BW17 testing, his cooperation remained essential to establishing the full historical record. Yet that same cooperation made him vulnerable both professionally and personally. Pierce clearly viewed him as compromised by emotional reaction to discovering his father's legacy, unable to maintain proper corporate perspective. But was that assessment accurate? Or was Richard demonstrating a more evolved understanding of corporate responsibility? One that recognized moral obligations alongside financial ones, that valued truth and accountability even when they carried significant costs. Tomorrow would bring critical developments: Richard's delivery of his father's journals, the hearing on Dr. Mills' testimony, potential testing of the buried drum sites. The case was accelerating toward a decisive phase where the fundamental questions would be answered. Would Blackwood Chemical's historical actions be fully exposed and addressed? Would the responsible parties face appropriate accountability? Would Silver Creek finally receive both truth and justice after decades of contamination and concealment? As night settled over Cincinnati, Maggie reviewed case materials in the secure accommodation, preparing for the crucial days ahead. Whatever Pierce might threaten, whatever resources he might deploy to protect himself and the company, the momentum of truth had begun to build. Dr. Mills had found his courage. Richard was confronting his father's legacy. Evidence was accumulating through multiple independent sources. The path forward remained challenging, the opposition formidable, the stakes extraordinarily high. But Maggie Reynolds had spent her career pursuing environmental justice against powerful corporate interests. This case, with its intertwined personal, corporate, and community dimensions, represented the culmination of that work. The buried secrets of Silver Creek and Blackwood Chemical were finally emerging, and no amount of corporate pressure or legal maneuvering would return them to darkness. With that conviction firmly in mind, she continued her preparations, determined that when morning came, she would be ready for whatever challenges it might bring. The chambers of justice are quiet now. Papers signed, truths entered into record, the machinery of accountability finally turning after decades of silence. Silver Creek will never be the same, neither healed nor whole, but awake at last to both its wounds and its worth. Some battles leave no true victors. Only those who survived to tell the story and those who didn't. The Blackwood name stands changed, no longer just emblazoned on paychecks and water towers, but now on remediation funds and medical clinics. A legacy rewritten in the twilight hours by a son who chose to face his father's shadows. Two warriors from opposite sides now walk the recovering shoreline, the attorney who wouldn't surrender and the executive who found courage in collapse. Between them flows a river slowly cleansing itself, carrying away decades of poison, one current at a time. Their conversation is quiet, punctuated by the calls of birds returning to waters long abandoned. There is a particular weight to hard-won truth, heavier than denial, yet somehow easier to carry. It settles differently on each heart that receives it. Some find in it closure, others purpose, and for a few, a chance to rebuild what was thought lost forever. Perhaps that's the nature of justice delayed. Not a perfect healing, but a chance to finally breathe without pretending the pain doesn't exist.